Good day, everyone. BOMA Greater Dallas is pleased to present this budget reforecasting webinar. We welcome all of you to the program. My name is Jacqueline Bird, BOMA Greater Dallas Secretary Treasurer, and I will be your moderator. Please note that today's call is being recorded. All participants will be muted during the broadcast. However, you can enter a question for us in the Q&A box at any time during the broadcast, and we'll address those questions at the end of the presentation. If you're listening to the audio only and do not have access to the chat box, you may submit your questions to cbransford@bomadallas.org, and we will address your questions after the broadcast. Before we get started, I would like to thank our BOMA Greater Dallas Foundation partners for their support. 5, ABM, Empire Roofing, FSG Facility Solutions Group, Night Restoration Services, Select Commercial Services, Sun Commercial Roofs, and United Protective Services. Now, while we may cover legal issues, this is not legal advice. Further, due to the rapidly changing nature of the law and the COVID-19 crisis, we recommend you consult with your legal counsel on this issue before you implement or change any policies or procedures. In today's webinar, we will address questions submitted by you during the online registration. We had a large number of questions submitted, so we apologize if we're not able to get to yours. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's panel. Today, we have with us Michael Walker of Texas Health Resources and Ryan Rothacker with Welltower. Good morning, Ryan. Or good afternoon, good day, Ryan. Good day, Michael. How are you?
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Good afternoon and good day to you as well.
Thank you. It's so great to see both of you guys. Listen, before we get started, I just thought I'd give you guys just a second to introduce yourself and a little bit about your company, and then we'll get on to the questions. Michael, would you like to start?
Certainly. Thank you. I'm Michael Walker. My role is Director of Real Estate Operations with Texas Health Resources, where I oversee all aspects of real estate operations, as well as construction, finish out, and well as an aspect of our acquisition and dispositions. It's good to be here with you, Jacqueline and Ryan, and all of those who are attending with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Ryan?
Yeah, my name's Ryan Rothacker, Vice President of Operations for Welltower. Welltower is the largest owner and operator of medical office buildings around the country. In my role, I oversee asset management, property management, maintenance, and leasing across our entire medical office building platform, which is made up of 425 buildings and about 23 million square feet across the country.
Wow. Awesome. Thank you both. Let's jump into the questions because I know you guys have a lot of experience and everybody can't wait to hear what your recommendations and suggestions are. So one of the first questions that we received is, how should I start reforecasting? I think this is a crazy time, so people are thinking, what do I do now? Who would like to take that question?
I'd jump right in, Jacqueline. I would say focus on the reality. Reforecasting largely is an exercise that's aimed at navigating, unexpected challenges and trying to understand how adversities are impacting your operating budget. Sort of as we're imagining we're trying to land a plane, if you will, it's really the intentional reevaluation of the variances that are impacting our budget. So I would say a great start is to focus on the reality that you're facing so you can gain a better understanding of revenue and operating expense variances that can give you a better position to predict where you're going to land at the end of the year.
That's good.
And I'll build on what Michael said. I like his comment about reality, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we address some of our other questions. But when I think about starting our reforecast, we always start with our actuals, because actuals is a good indicator of where the future is going to be. Then you got to look to the future. So once you understand, having a good understanding of what your actual financial statement variances are, or what the actual market conditions are, that'll help lead you to a better reforecast in the future. And then always start with what I call the big ticket items, your major movers in the reforecast. Don't sweat the small stuff. Focus first on the big things so you do not miss a large variance that needs to be reforecasted.
Yeah, so I think you're kind of hitting on what one of our other questions is, and it's what are the things that we shouldn't forget when we're reforecasting? And so you've hit on some of those. Michael, would you like to add to that, or Ryan?
I'll jump in and add a little bit to that. So sorry about that. I've got a motion sensor on in my light. So when I think about what you should consider, or some of the things that are forgotten in a reforecast, is not only, I think everyone on this call probably knows they got to reforecast, go through the rent roll, reforecast leasing assumptions, go through their operating expense list, reforecast operating expenses. A lot of times it's the things below the line that get missed. Things like owner's expense or capital improvements. Make sure you're reforecasting that. In an organization like at Welltower, my responsibility is to make sure I reforecast overhead. Typically, you don't have as much overhead on an individual building, but if you're over a department or a larger group of people, make sure you're reforecasting your overhead projections. And then obviously the external things. This pandemic we find ourselves in has really made it interesting to reforecast, which I know we'll get to in a little bit. But don't forget about the external factors that will impact your reforecast.
Yeah, that's good. Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just add that, again, don't forget you really are attempting to better understand your year-end position. And so while your reforecasting is not an opportunity to rebudget, it really is an opportunity to establish a really good understanding of where we're headed. And so don't forget, as you work through those touch points that Ryan mentioned, that ultimately we're really trying to unearth any surprises. We're trying to better understand any changes. We're trying to better understand any opportunities that are before us right now to help us as we're understanding what's going on with expenses and revenue.
Yes. Someone asked, what are the things I want to look for when reforecasting? But I think you've kind of hit on that. I think some things that people should look for is, what didn't I do previously because of COVID-19 or whatever reason that I need to look, that I can do later. Another question is, what is the most important part of reforecasting?
I'll jump in. I would say, and that's a really challenging question, because I think it varies to some extent depending upon operational goals that have been set forth or key targets. But at a base level, I would say, it's unearthing the cause and cure of the variances which threaten your potential to stay on budget. Going through that deep exercise of really trying to figure out what are the causes and what are the cures. It's important to really understand how cause and even the duration of key events really impact the circumstances that jeopardize your budget.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I really add to that is know your audience. So there's property managers that might be on this call that work on behalf of private equity firms. There's some that work on behalf of REITs or foreign investors versus US investors. And depending on the different forces and factors that they're under will help you understand how you should reforecast. To give you an example, I work for a publicly traded REIT. So my audience is our executive committee, which the ultimate audience is Wall Street. Mm-hmm. And so in this portfolio, I need to focus on financial metrics and reforecasting financial metrics that make sense for Wall Street or the pressures that Wall Street is grading Welltower on. In my past experience, I worked for a private equity firm. We had much different hot topics that our investors were concerned about. So in a publicly traded REIT, same store growth is very important. Total earnings is very important. those two metrics aren't tracked in a private equity world. Private equity is more how soon can you distribute cash to our investors and increase our multiple and IRR. So know who your audience is and make sure you're factoring their pressures into what your reforecast. It'll help you focus on what you need to reforecast.
That's really good. A question that's come up is, how should I handle the unknowns?
The best way I can answer that is, this is where I'm going to pick up on what Michael said earlier about reality. Do not add cushion to a reforecast just to account for unknowns. There are going to be unknowns that happen. We'll talk about frequency in a minute. A reforecast, at least in my world, is not one and done. You want to continually reforecast throughout the year, but more importantly, use that reforecast throughout the year. So in a publicly traded REIT world, we've done our first quarter reforecast already. Now my whole team is comparing their actual performance to our first quarter reforecast. So our budget has pretty much gone out the window. Now, obviously with COVID, our entire company pulled our earnings guidance. So now we're living in a much different world. However, to what Michael said earlier, you want a realistic reforecast. You don't want to provide your asset manager or owner with an overly conservative reforecast. And frankly, you don't want to look like a superhero telling them you're going to be very aggressive and hit these goals that you just, are going to be really hard to hit. Keep your reforecast realistic. Don't add cushion in it just to protect the downside or cover your butt, as some would say. Give a realistic reforecast. You will likely have 2 more opportunities to tighten your reforecast as the year goes on.
That's good. That's good. Michael?
I would add to it that unknowns are just part of the process to some extent. So that's some of the relief there. However, to add on to what Ryan shared, we really want to double down and shift into the mode of doing the best we can to arrive at evidence-based estimations. Ryan certainly hit the nail on the head. Don't want to find ourselves padding, or don't want to find ourselves really trying to look like a superhero, but we really want to put our best effort forward in doubling down to develop best educated estimations of where we really believe we will land based on the realities that we're facing.
That's good. Let's see, a question that was submitted earlier is, what is your biggest concern when reforecasting?
I'll start there. One is obtaining accurate data. As we're in that reforecasting mode, we want to make sure the data is accurate. We want to make sense of the collected data. And then we want to take those two and merge those together to really understand our remaining position and weigh that against what and I will talk about this a little later, but what our definition of success is for that particular year and how we're going to make adjustments to get there. So it's really obtaining good data and making really good sense of the data that we've actually collected.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, it's teamwork. If you think about a reforecast, it can never be done by one single person, at least in our world, managing publicly traded medical office buildings, because we have a separate leasing team that is closest to the market and to the brokers in the market and to our health system partners. Then you have a property management team who manage our vendors and also manage our tenant relationships, and to a certain extent influence renewals. Then we have our asset managers, and the asset managers in our world they really take point on our reforecast. So they're the quarterback of the reforecast process for Welltower. But you can't forget about the maintenance team. Sometimes the maintenance team is closer to how the equipment's running, and they could be a good indicator of how to reforecast your capital expenditures. Every owner likes to save money, obviously, so a lot of owners will look towards their building improvement spend to try to improve cash flow. That's where it's critical to get your maintenance team's buy-in before you, as a financial person, or myself running a department or a division. It's easy for me to say, cut that project out of the budget. But if I have a maintenance tech telling me, look, it's going to cost us more to maintain this piece of equipment for the next year and a half to get through the pandemic than it is to replace it now, you've got to listen to those people too. Mm-hmm. So it really takes a true team effort to put forth the most realistic forecast.
Yeah, that's good insight. So as we're talking about reforecasting, the question came up, how often should reforecasts be done, and even how far in advance should they be made?
This is one that Michael and I might have varying answers on. So being in a publicly traded company, we do essentially 4 reforecasts a year. So we do 3 formal reforecasts, and then our budget process acts as our 4th and final reforecast, which is also a budget for the following year. So I'm always a proponent of doing your budget as late in the year as you can. And that works at publicly traded companies who can dictate when they release their earnings guidance. Wall Street always wants to know, tell me what next year is going to look like. Tell me what next year is going to look like. They're always putting pressure on our executives. They want to know because they're trading your stock every day. Well, you've got to manage Wall Street's expectations, and Welltower's done a good job of that by pushing off our earnings. In fact, we never release earnings for the upcoming year until January of that year. So that gives me the ability to put forth a better, more accurate budget, and then also give our executives a really good look into where we're going to end the year by October, because that's when we start our budget process, and that's our 4th and final reforecast for the year.
That's good. Michael?
I would say, interestingly enough, Ryan and I are actually not far apart at all. We follow the same methodology, Ryan. We're a very large nonprofit health system, but we follow the same metrics. It's 3 official a year, and we use the budget as a 4th one as well. And so I would piggyback on Ryan's initial comment. It does vary some from organization to organization, but it's not uncommon to find at least 3 official reforecasts, and the budget plays a role in there somewhere.
Yeah. So I would imagine that a lot of people that are working out there could be working for private equity firms. And Ryan, you mentioned earlier that you worked for a private equity firm. What was typical for them? What's the difference between what you're experiencing with a REIT and what you experienced with a private equity firm?
My experience at a REIT is a much more formal reforecasting process. Working on the private equity side, unless you're required to reforecast for your investors, it would not be uncommon to not reforecast on the private equity side. Private equity has a little more constraints and restrictions from a lending perspective. Typically, every private equity owner of a medical office or any office or industrial building will have debt on it. So sometimes the lender will dictate whether or not you have to provide a formal reforecast. But if the lender doesn't require it and your investors don't, I would bet some private equity firms don't even do a reforecast. So it's just not right or wrong. It's just, again, know who your audience is and what your audience expects out of you.
Generally, as a property manager, would you recommend that they at least, even if they're not required to do it, maybe look at it at a mid-year point, as it might affect their operating cost recoveries?
Absolutely. Yep. As a leader of your division, you're going to be held accountable for results, and you want to know what the rest of the year is going to look like. And again, getting back to Michael's comment, I want a realistic view on what the rest of the year is going to look like, because I'm going to be held accountable to that reforecast. And I will tell everyone on this call, it's actually just as disheartening for me to see us beat our reforecast significantly as it is to come in behind our reforecast significantly. So again, I just want to stress, don't be ultra conservative, because it's almost more embarrassing to go to an executive committee and say, look, I misled you. We actually did have a pretty good year. It's the better conversation to have is, look, we tried to push our team to achieve these results. This is where we fell short. That's frankly an easier conversation for me to have than the opposite one with our executive team.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you guys want to talk about some COVID-19 specific questions as it relates to reforecasting?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So with everything that's happened with COVID-19, is there anything specifically related to COVID-19 that property managers should be thinking about right now?
I'll let Michael take that one first.
Yeah, I think the key word there is specific. Seems like as we are trying to get our arms and minds wrapped around the impact and the implications of COVID-19, just to get us started, I would say, property managers or our PM should be thinking about navigation. We're really in a period of transition. We're hearing all sorts of comments about we're in a new norm. The reality is we're not actually in the new norm yet. We're somewhere between what we understood as normal and what will become the new norm. And so PMs would want to spend some time rolling up their sleeves, really working on the navigation of understanding this transition period that we're in, as we're looking ahead, because the reality is so long as COVID-19 is within our borders, there will be a real need for our PMs and all of our teams collectively to really understand the implications of COVID-19. What's really interesting is researchers are already sort of doing what researchers like to do, and that's sort of predict where they think we're going to be. And quite honestly, the jury is still out. Among some scholars that I know, everybody has said that the best approach is to say, I don't know, because the one who doesn't know is probably the one who's right. But some of the realities that we need to face is this: just historically in our country, the commercial office environment has historically always bounced back from a major event that has occurred in our land, with the most recent and memorable one being 9/11. What we can ascertain from some of our historical data, even if we go back and look at 9/11, it typically takes, with a significant event of that nature, about a 12 to 18 month period where we go through this transitional adjustment and we begin to understand what the new norm is for the commercial office environment. So I would stress to our listening audience to really roll our sleeves up and try to do our best to understand some of the components of the transition so we can better put our buildings and assets in a position to be successful in the future.
Okay.
And I would say specifically on, kind of the owner, developer side of the world, one thing you typically don't always do during a reforecast is look at your debt service covenants. Your reforecast is a good time to look at that because a lot of companies are deferring rent for their tenants, and some of your debt service covenants will require you to either maintain a certain level of cash on hand or other operating metrics that you have to achieve. And as we all know, likely most of us saw a slowdown in our leasing efforts as soon as COVID hit. So that will have implications on your debt service covenants as well. So that's something I just want to remind everyone to think about in their reforecast this year. And then the other thing that sometimes gets overlooked in a reforecast is your bad debt. So don't forget about bad debt. As a publicly traded company at Welltower, I will tell you in our first quarter earnings call, it was all focused around how much cash are we deferring for our customers? Are we still able to make our dividend payment? We do have debt service payments, but they're not at the building level. They're at the corporate level. But bad debt was also asked about quite a bit on our earnings call because we just don't know who's going to survive through the pandemic yet. We're still in the pandemic. I think we'd all agree we're still in the pandemic. And I just told our CFO yesterday, I don't think I'm going to have a realistic view on our bad debt until the month of July, whether it be July 1st or towards the end of July, because we still have some buildings located in states around the country that healthcare systems were just allowed to begin elective surgeries. So we just don't know yet, but I wanted to share at least a few pointers on things to be thinking about during your reforecast in light of COVID that you might not otherwise have thought about.
Yeah, that's really good. When we think about COVID and reforecasting, reforecasting sometimes goes beyond just the operational expenses, but sometimes capital projects as well. And so how are some owners addressing those big projects that were scheduled to start, say, in March, but got pushed back or might not even happen at all? Are you guys seeing that?
That's a great question.
Go ahead, Mike.
I think there's some variation there, obviously, in approaching that from ownership to ownership. But if I could try to boil that down to three buckets, I'd say in bucket one, there are priorities. So we want to prioritize, figure out what our priorities are. In another bucket, there are deferments, trying to figure out what our actually deferments are. And then in a third bucket, Ryan mentioned it a few moments ago, what are our safety imperatives? And trying to figure all of that out in the midst of making adjustments, I think are three very realistic buckets that are sort of similar avenues that we're all facing in the midst of our new reality.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Good deal. So do you think that COVID-19 will change capital improvement, how we manage capital improvement expenditures next year and even in the years going forward?
That is a really good question, and I thought about that when I saw the question. And I'll piggyback on what Michael said previously. We did do a more deep dive and thorough scrub of our building improvements, our leasing commissions, and our TIs across our portfolio. And we are going to defer capital to the extent we can to free up cash flow, particularly during the next 3 months when we're working with our customers to give them some rent deferral. Then once cash flow improves, starting July and thereafter, we'll start easing restrictions on what our property managers can do when it comes to building improvements. Now the bigger question is when I go to budget next year, being a publicly traded company, we try to operate within certain metrics that Wall Street expects us to hit. One of those metrics is we manage our CapEx as a percentage of our net operating income. So while I will come in way under budget this year on that metric because we're pausing several large projects that aren't critical, that we can live 12 more months with, I can't tell you today whether we're going to then have to push out our 2021 capital into 2022, but I can tell you I don't think Wall Street will react favorably if I come in with double the number that they're expecting me to come in at next year. So from my perspective, it's going to be a balancing act. I don't think we'll quite double the amount of CapEx that we'll want to do next year, but I do think I will give our team some leeway to come in higher than what I normally would expect them to because of COVID-19.
Makes sense. How about from your perspective, Michael?
I think, honestly, it would not be out of bounds to expect some adjustments to the 2021 capital year. But I would add to the discussion point that really a key component of this will be the reformed definitions of success within our organization.
It looks like
Drives our excellence. And so in the midst of this being, really hard to reform what success is so that we can get that message succinct, get it pushed out across the system or our divisions, respectively, departments, and get everybody geared toward the reformed success so we can then put together our excellence initiatives. But I don't think it's out of bounds at all to expect 2021 to have some adjustments when it comes to CapEx.
And you were talking about success, and one of the other things that came up or questions that came up was asking, how do you create a reforecast that plans for success but also takes into account all the uncertainty around our current situation?
I think that's more of a question of not so much reforecasting, because I think you've heard from both Michael and I that the reforecast needs to be realistic. Right. So I turned in probably the worst reforecast I've ever had in my 20-year career of doing this. Just, last month when we did our first quarter, I was actually fortunate that the COVID events happened right as we were starting our first quarter forecast. And we were able to account for it and be able to communicate to Wall Street quickly on where we think we're going to come in. So I still think your reforecast needs to be realistic. The question more is, how do you successfully manage your building or your business through the pandemic? And BOMA has been a great resource for real estate managers. These forums have been a great resource to give our, property and real estate managers ideas on what they need to be thinking about. I think ultimately the success of the pandemic needs to be first and foremost the safety of everyone involved. Then once everyone can operate safely and your buildings, I'm sure, are starting to reopen, then you got to be thinking about your leasing initiatives. What marketing campaigns can you be running? How do you change your marketing campaign to make up the lost ground for 2 months of no leasing activity in Texas and 3 months of no leasing activity in New York? And then your property managers will be challenged with that same challenge on operating expenses. We are going to see an increase in expenses. So far, for the number of tenants that have closed down temporarily during COVID, we saved enough money there to offset the cost for adding additional signage, hand sanitizing units, things like that. But I do think we are going to incur more costs than what we saved over the last 2 months by the time we hit the end of the year. So that's where real estate managers need to factor into their reforecast just their best, their best estimate of what they think is going to happen going forward.
Yeah, very good points. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I just, again, on that topic of success, I think it's incredibly challenging to plan for success until there is an agreed upon and disclosed definition of that success in the midst of the pandemic that we're facing. And so it's going to be imperative on us at every level of the organization to really understand how the organizational goals are going to shift as a result of the pandemic. And then as we understand that definition, which is obviously rooted in current realities and also future projection, it really helps our teams, so to say, really strive to hit that definition. I think it all hinges on really establishing what the reform definition of success is and getting that message out properly across the board, and then start moving our people toward those new objectives that we're trying to hit in the midst of this pandemic.
Good. A question that came up is about everyone's trying to figure out what's the best way to go about keeping buildings clean and safe as it relates to COVID-19. And so the question is, should hospital-grade disinfection cleaning become standard protocol? And what's a reasonable cost to expect if we're budgeting for that?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. A lot of folks are asking that question right now. Let me tackle it this way. It starts here. It starts with a fundamental question. What is a safe building with COVID-19 in America? That's your launching. That's your point of demarcation. And so I think, when it comes to disinfectants, I would say property managers and operational teams want to look at not only disinfectants, but a host of approaches that would help them establish a sound message that the buildings that they're managing is actually safe. I think the public awareness, the public consciousness, and much of the discussions around public health and the realities thereof will inherently place a pressure on all of us to figure out what are going to be the new best approaches to defining a safe building in light of COVID-19.
Yeah, this is probably not fair to have two healthcare guys on this call, because I think both of us have always in our environments used those kind of cleaning agents. Yeah. That's like a green cleaning point I can never get credit for at Welltower because we need to use those cleaning agents on a daily basis. But to Michael's point, safety is more than just the cleanliness of the building. We're focusing a lot on how do we reduce the touch points as soon as you walk into a medical building. It was funny, just this morning, I had an interaction with somebody on our team. Should we be taking temperature scans at the door of our medical office buildings? My answer to that was, number one, Welltower property management doesn't have the ability to do that with our in-house staff. But number two, people who have temperatures need to come into a medical building. We have people with temperatures in our buildings every day, and then that's where both healthy and sick people go. Now, we need to be thinking about restricting them to different access points in the building, but that's another way that you can, on the healthcare side, keep your visitors safer. So it's more than just the cleaning agents. And, everyone, I think if you've listened to all the BOMA webinars we've had over the last month, we could beat that horse, but it's more than just cleaning. It's all of reducing all of your touch points in the building and communicating more effectively with your vendors and your tenants.
Yeah. And I would also add to Jacqueline that to Ryan's point, the two healthcare guys on the call today tend to live in this world, but for our listening audience that's in the commercial office world, there is the need to also balance risk versus reward in this session. So you really want to be having tight discussions with your risk management folks, with your attorneys, your general counsel, as well as all of your experts in the respective teams of the division, because you're also having this balancing act of making sure that we're sort of catching ourselves and holding ourselves accountable to not inherently create exposures we don't need to create, but we also want to make sure that we balance the risk versus the perceived rewards.
That's a great point.
It is. It really is. I want to take a moment just to ask those out that are watching. If you have any questions, do go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and we will address them as we begin to wrap up our questions here. But my next question to both of you, still with regard to COVID-19, is how will it affect our CAM?
Adversely.
Yeah. That's my crystal ball right now. Is I think your common area expenses are going to increase.
Yes.
I think it's actually going to increase more on the traditional office side than it will on the medical office side, because a lot of the safety, cleaning, touch point precautions we already take on the medical office side. But on your downtown high rise or any suburban office, these are just things you guys, those managers aren't dealing with on a daily basis. So I suspect the costs are going to be much greater in the commercial office sector than the commercial medical office sector.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with that.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't see any new questions popping up in the Q&A, so I want to go to kind of our wrap-up time. And my question to you guys are, what are your top 2 reforecasting tips? If you were talking to someone who was new to this reforecasting thing and you could only give them 2 things that they needed to do, what would you tell them? The top 2 anyway.
I'll jump in here. So first, you already heard it from us. Be realistic. Don't be overly aggressive or overly conservative. And my second tip is don't sweat the small stuff. A reforecast is just that. It's your best guess at where the building is going to operate for the rest of the year. Don't waste time digging through your interior plant contract or your walk-off map contract. That's not going to move the needle. Just focus on the major movers.
That's good. Michael?
I would boil it down to make evidence-based decisions and be transparent.
Good.
Very good. Very good. And then as we wrap up, the question we've come to love to ask everyone is, on a positive note, and this has been a very positive discussion, but on a positive note, what is one thing that has come out of this shelter in place and working from home that you've seen? And it can be personal or professional.
I'll let Michael tackle that one first if he's ready.
Okay, I'll just try to jump in. I would say we've been reminded life is precious, and all of us have more in common than meets the eye.
That's good.
And mine's not going to be as thought-provoking as Michael's, but for me personally, it's the first time I've done a Zoom video or any sort of video chat. And that's my personal one. And then professionally, believe it or not, this has actually opened my eyes that there are a number of people in the Welltower organization who can conduct their work efficiently from home. You know, I'm a perfect example of that because I work on a national basis. I do travel a lot. So my work schedule has adjusted, but I do have an office in a medical office building in Frisco. And I don't really need to put myself at risk going into a medical office building day in and day out. Now, there are certain members of our team who it is critical for them to still access the buildings, and we're equipping them to do that safely. But if you don't have to be in the building, at least in my environment, and there's several people on our team who don't, we're going to keep them out as long as we can. And frankly, it might be a permanent decision too, that we will allow them to work from home in certain capacities.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, definitely a lot of great things have come out of what seemed a terrible thing. And it's great to have both of you guys with us today and sharing your background, your knowledge, your expertise, and your time with us and everyone that's on this webinar. So thank you both today. We appreciate you. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who submitted the questions and for each of you who joined us today. And then finally, I want to give a special thanks to our BOMA Greater Dallas Foundation partners for their support. They are 5, ABM, Empire Roofing, FSG Facility Solutions Group, Night Restoration Services, Select Commercial Services, Sun Commercial Roofs, and United Protective Services. And then finally, everyone, we know there's so much information that you need. So we've compiled all of our COVID-19 webinars and documents on our website under the COVID-19 resources page at bomadallas.org. And again, we just want to thank you. And to everyone, we say, have a good day. Bye, guys.
Goodbye.